So Eurogamer just had a very big interview, I would say, with a very big person at Sega. His name is Shuji Utsumi. Now, he is the president and COO of Sega of America. He is definitely an industry veteran, and that is to say the least. He has definitely been around the block quite a bit. He has worked with Sony, even Disney, and of course Sega. Now, it sounds like he actually used to work with Sega way back in the day, but now he is legitimately permanently just full-time a Sega employee, and it has been that way for the past 5 years now. And this interview, I think, was very good. It revealed a lot. If you are at all into Sega, it's really just a great thing to hear everything that he is talking about. I'm actually going to start off here by saying the very last thing that was in the interview. I'm going to begin with the end because I think that it pretty much highlights everything that he was trying to say, and that is just these 4 words, quote, "Sega is coming back." Yeah, there's a lot to this interview, and I am linking it in the description. I would definitely recommend checking it out, but kind of just the cliff notes, kind of the summary. Essentially, he is wanting to focus on what works for Sega and maybe focus less on what doesn't work, especially when considering like their return on investment. So he talked, for example, about the arcade industry. Now, this is kind of interesting. I actually didn't really think that Sega still made arcade video games. I actually didn't even really think about like any company ever making arcade games really in the past like 10 or 20 years now. Since arcades, I mean, let's face it, are just kind of dying out. I mean, don't get me wrong, I still think they're awesome. I love arcades, but I haven't been to one, you know, in like a decade or more, and I mean, yeah, they're definitely just kind of fading away with the obvious availability now of, you know, consoles, computers, and even phones just being able to play games. It kind of renders arcades, I don't want to say useless, but definitely not as useful. So yeah, he basically talked about the return on investment for arcades being low. He saw that, so he basically pulled out a lot of their staff in Sega's arcade industry recently and put them onto the important games, kind of the games that really sell. And with that, and kind of with this whole Sega is coming back thing, yeah, he wants to focus a lot on especially these really big IPs. It's kind of like the big 3, I think, is kind of the takeaway I got here. Like, to him, I think the big 3 is Sega, Yakuza, and Persona. Yeah, he wants to just focus a lot of energy and resources and, of course, money into these IPs. But they even talked about other IPs as well, Jet Set Radio, Golden Axe, stuff like that. And then kind of the big thing here that he talked about, kind of the big highlight that I saw that people were talking about with this interview, is he kind of compared Sega and their games in contrast to Nintendo and their games back in the day, back in the 80s and 90s. He compared that to like rock and roll music versus pop music. He basically said that, like, you know, back in the day, Sega was to Nintendo as rock and roll was to pop. You know, back then especially, like, you know, pop music was just always there, whereas rock and roll music was kind of this new edgy thing. And he basically wants to get back to these roots now. You know, he is kind of acknowledging that Nintendo kind of continues to be mainstream, whereas Sega kind of lost this over the few decades that have passed since that era. And I think this really makes sense to try to revive this sort of reputation and personality. You know, if you are somebody that is quite a bit older than me, at least from how I've been reading it, you know, back in the 90s, you will definitely remember that Sega was kind of this sort of edgy kind of game studio. When compared to a lot of the others at the time, they could just, it would seem, do more, and it was just a lot more fun than some of the other studios. Yeah, the more I read, the more it just kind of sounds like Sega just kind of had this way about them with their games. Like, to me, it kind of reminds me of like Rareware, you know, like I grew up kind of on like Banjo-Kazooie and, you know, those kind of games, Donkey Kong 64, like, you know, any of those classic N64 Rare games, to me, just had kind of a certain style, a certain flow, and that was kind of how Sega was with their own brand back in the 90s. So yeah, Shuji is saying that, yeah, they want to get back to this, and so far, it's definitely paying off. They've been doing great, especially, surprisingly, with movies. Yeah, that's what's weird, like Sonic 3 is coming out, I think, in about a week now. It's got a lot of hype behind it. I'm sure it's going to do great, and Sonic 1 and 2 also did fantastic. He kind of did talk a little bit about Transmedia as well, you know, extending beyond just video games, and yeah, it's definitely working for Sega, as we can obviously see with the Sonic movies. So Sega going back to their roots, I think, would be very cool, I mean, for everybody. If you're a classic Sega fan, you know, from the 90s, I mean, it would be, of course, awesome to think of them really bringing this reputation back. But then for people like me, me, or even people who are younger than me, it would be really cool too. Because while I didn't really grow up with Sega in this golden age, I would love to see them make some sort of a comeback like this. You know, I remember it being said a few months ago from another big Sega executive that they have a goal that down the line they want Sonic to be as well known of an IP to just the general population as Mario. And I know that might sound crazy, but you know, with this strategy, with them really focusing on what works, I could see that actually happening sometime down the line.